The morning commute to work in London has seen heavily crowded buses and underground trains since the end of lockdown restrictions. Transport for London, which operates the public transport system, has given more than a €1.7 billion bailout after seeing its income fall by 90%. The London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has also raised the congestion charge, eliminated some fare breaks, but is also asking people to avoid public transport where possible. Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Siobhan Benita, the Liberal Democrat candidate for London Mayor. Thank you very much for speaking to us. So this is difficult. They've had to raise prices, but also tell the public not to travel on public transport. So how should commuters be getting around the capital?
Yeah, hi Rosie. I think it's really confusing for Londoners at the moment. Hard-working Londoners, often people on the lowest wages, they're being told they need to go back to work at the moment. But actually, we don't have, I don't think, enough measures in place to make that safe for them at the moment. So I think the current Mayor Sadiq Khan could have done a lot more to put in place a process that limits the number of people, for example, that goes on each bus or goes on each tube. We've seen far too much overcrowding already on our transport system, and I think that's making people feel really unsafe. And of course, now we have the bailout from central government for TfL because it was losing so much money. The bailout was absolutely necessary, but it's a really bad deal for Londoners. So under 18s have lost their passes. They can't travel free anymore on the buses. We've seen the concessions been taken away for the disabled and the over 60s at peak times. I think there's so much more that should be done in London now to help both staff working on the transport network and passengers be able to move around safely. I'd like to see
the London Mayor was honest. He said this wasn't the deal he wanted, but it was the only deal the government put on the table. So he also admitted, I had no choice but to accept it to keep the tubes and buses running. We'd be in a worse situation, I guess, if people couldn't get to work at all. You're saying more should be done to protect Londoners when they're taking public transport. What do you suggest?
So I've suggested, for example, that there needs to be a limit. So there needs to be a management system on the tubes and the buses so that you can't get overcrowding on that system. From the minute that we went into lockdown, there should have been plans put in place for when the easing of lockdown happened. And unfortunately, it looks like London wasn't ready for that. TfL wasn't ready for that. I'd like to see express buses, so new express bus routes put on to relieve some of the pressure on the tubes. Let's send a clear message that people can use e-scooters, for example, on some of the new cycle networks that have been put into place. What about looking at flexible fares to encourage people to travel at different times of the day? So as I've said, I understand people now need to start going back to work, but I really think that between the party politics of central government and the Labour Mayor, Londoners are actually paying a very heavy price at the moment. And I think a lot more should be done to put their safety first and the safety of staff on the transport network. We've sadly seen quite a few deaths of people who work on TfL. They didn't get protective equipment early enough, so a lot more could have been done. I do agree that the bailout was necessary, but TfL's finances were already in a terrible mess, and that's definitely weakened.
They were in a terrible state, but they lost 90% of their income. It's difficult to run any business on just 10% of the revenue that you were expecting before. Also, London's economy's got to keep going, and that's reliant on people being able to get to work. So how do you balance that? If you limit the numbers of people who can take public transport, you might then be stopping some people get to work full stop. How do you get around that?
Yeah, definitely. And we have a model for TfL that's reliant on passenger fares. That's what pays for that model. So actually, going forward now, we need to look fundamentally at the business model for TfL. The Liberal Democrats, myself, I've been proposing for a long time that we move to a smart road pricing system, for example, that actually spreads some of that burden to drivers and not just requiring passengers of public transport to pay for TfL. We need to really think hard about a sustainable finance model for TfL going forward. I'm not saying this bailout wasn't necessary. It absolutely was necessary. I'm just saying that the current mayor had a very weak hand in those negotiations because TfL's finances were already in a mess. We know
and the
now
current mayor has said that they will have to renegotiate how they pay for Transport for London going forward. Thank you very much, Siobhan Benita, the Liberal Democrat candidate for London Mayor.